My default radio station was LBC, and I unfortunately wasted far too many hours listening to a few of their presenters. The only people that I listen to on LBC nowadays are Majid Nawaz, who does a weekend afternoon show from 1pm till 4, and if I'm awake at 4am, I might let Steve Allen offer me some tittle-tattle as he lets rip on TV people he deems talentless. I now much prefer to listen to talk radio, and I do this via YouTube, and I'll listen to segments from Julia Harley-Brewer and Ian Collins, who both used to work for LBC, plus Kevin O'Sullivan, Dan Wootton and Mark Dolan. Their views are far more aligned to mine, especially regarding COVID-19. And the guests they interview are also people whose views are broadly similar to mine, which is something I cannot say about some LBC presenters and their guests. The co-authors of the Great Barrington Declaration have been interviewed on talk radio before, and these eminent professors' views have been dismissed by Health Secretary Nat Hancock. Prime Minister Boris Johnson's preferred scientists have convinced the masses that this virus can tell the time, has a basic ability at maths, and can distinguish between people that drink in a pub to those that drink and eat a substantial meal in a pub, and will only attack those not eating a big meal when knocking back some alcohol. This is the first virus to acquire intelligence and a malevolent targeted strategy. History should, if documented accurately, not look favourably upon Boris Johnson, Nat Hancock, Chris Whitty, Patrick Vallance and the SAGE Committee with their highly damaging and disproportionately harsh and economically decimating methods to control a virus that to date has proven not to be a modern version of the Black Death. Yet one can be forgiven after listening to mainstream media and Boris Johnson's scientific advisors that COVID is the number one cause of death, yet it doesn't rank in the top 10. Statistically, the average age of those who have died allegedly with COVID-19 in England and Wales is 82. Professor Sunetra Gupta, one of the co-authors of the Great Barrington Declaration, is interviewed here by Talk Radio's Mark Dolan.
Barrington Declaration that identifies a different approach for COVID-19, one that involves targeted protection of the vulnerable and a return to relatively normal life for those who do not face a mortal threat from the virus. It's Professor Sunetra Gupta, Professor of Theoretical Epidemiology at the University of Oxford. Professor Gupta, welcome to the show.
Hello.
Are we a little overly focused on testing? Because it has been characterised as the holy grail for months now. Is it even the right approach?
Well, I suppose it won't surprise you to hear me say no, I don't think it is. I think it's quite important to use testing as the Office of National Statistics does and the REACT study to try and understand what the baseline level is of infection in the population. Obviously, that's an important background piece of information. But in terms of a tool to try and prevent deaths, I think we should be using these limited resources to try and protect the vulnerable at the risk of sounding like a broken record. That, I think, is our primary responsibility. And I think we would be better, it would be better if we took these resources and focused them on trying to create an infection-free environment for those who are at risk of death.
Well, indeed. I mean, so far, the running costs of the test and trace system are in excess of £12 billion. I mean, that's a huge investment, and we don't seem to be paying dividends. If we look to Germany, who do have a much admired, perhaps world-class testing protocol, well, their numbers are going up, and they are now going into a national lockdown. So perhaps this is, discredits the whole concept.
Well, I mean, obviously, test and trace has its place in controlling certain diseases like Ebola, or indeed even, certain, well, diseases that are where the route of transmission can be identified correctly. But even there, for example, with sexually transmitted diseases, test and trace hasn't rid us of gonorrhea. So it's very, very tricky to use that method to get rid of a respiratory infection where 85% are asymptomatic and it's just so terribly infectious. And also one where, as we know now, the infectious period is quite restricted, but the infectiousness in that period is really high. So you get these massive clusters of infection and then nothing at all. So it's quite difficult to sort of target those events using a test and trace policy. On top of which, there are also methodological difficulties with how we're testing. So we are at the moment testing to see if anybody has any fragment of virus at all in their noses, and that doesn't tell you whether they're infectious. So that's also not ideal in terms of constructing a strategy to contain the deaths.
Well, indeed. I mean, do you question the veracity, the accuracy of many of these thousands of positive outcomes, these positive results?
Well, certainly if they are being used, run to a point where all they're detecting is fragments of virus, that's really not telling you much about who is currently infectious. And nonetheless, of course, they can serve as a proxy for telling you whether infections are going up or down, and I would not dispute that they're going up, but that is not a reason for the kind of panic that is already starting to congeal in the system.
I think it's extremely valuable that we have a national conversation about the COVID measures. Nobody is suggesting that the rules should be ignored, but we're allowed to challenge them. And you've helped us do that. And you and your colleagues at the Great Barrington Declaration have offered a different view, inspired in part by Sweden. However, Professor Gupta, you're a person of science, you're a scientific mind, but you're also a human being, and you must sort of be rather sort of chastened by the daily figures that are coming in at the moment. So 24,500 new cases in the last 24 hours, but we are seeing the deaths in several hundreds now, 300 and above. Does this cause you pause for thought?
No, I think that it's still, what causes me pause for thought is that we're not protecting the vulnerables. So the deaths are mounting because we're not doing we're not enacting focused protection. So that does cause me distress, that instead of, using our resources to protect the vulnerable, we're willfully locking down a whole bunch of people where a rise in infections is nothing to worry about. That's what happens with a number of respiratory infections. So I think we're just not focusing on the right part of the problem. The problem is obviously there and it has to be dealt with. It's a question of how we deal with it. And the other issue is we must put on the table the costs of lockdown. And until we have the collateral damage in the same view as the damage that this virus is wreaking, I don't think we can arrive at a solution that creates the least harm for the entire population.
Notwithstanding, and I've on this programme called for a death toll for those who have lost their lives due to untreated other illnesses, and of course there will be a long-term tragic death toll from, economic deprivation. If you crash the economy, you create poverty. Poverty kills, which is obviously a more abstract number, but sadly it will most likely be a big number. However, specifically on the COVID measures that we're seeing in England, a three-tiered approach, are you suggesting that actually what the government are doing at the moment and what's happening, on another level in France and Germany is going to cost more lives? Are you saying that these lockdowns are killing more people?
Yes, I think I am. In the long run, I think we will see that, which is why we are concerned. But before I in order to substantiate that, what we need is a proper catalogue of the horrors or the destruction, devastation caused by lockdown. So at the moment, that's what we're trying to do, rather than just, have a pillow fight over this. What we need are the numbers. So at the moment, I'm involved with a bunch of people to get a website up that will systematically catalogue what lockdown is doing, not just to our country, but internationally around the world, because I think this is a global responsibility that we have. So once those are there, I think what we need to do is sit down and have a rational discussion about what's the best way forward. And that's really all we wanted to do with that declaration. We didn't want to set up some nasty little academic dispute.
Well, indeed not. What do you say to those who might suggest that the Great Barrington Declaration and individuals like yourself are dangerous, or frankly are conspiracy theorists, nut jobs, eccentrics, ne'er-do-wells?
Well, I think it's extremely unfortunate that they should attack us in that way. Personal attacks are not acceptable. I think it would be much better if they focused on the science or the policy. I myself would describe myself as very much someone from the left of the Labour Party anyway. So it's kind of hard for me to understand why anyone would describe my politics as libertarian. And it's a gross insult to say that we might be in the pockets of libertarian think tanks. These are just awful, gross, personal insults. And the fact that they are coming from academics, fellow academics, is extremely distressing.
Well, we know, don't we, Professor, that ultimately time will tell as to what the right strategy might have been. But it's important that we debate these measures. We're borrowing on an unprecedented scale from future generations. We're locking society down, creating mental health crises, and ultimately we could potentially be doing more harm than good with measures like face coverings or lockdowns. We don't know yet, but it's important we discuss it. Why is it that aspects of the scientific community are so ideological, so religiously attached to these lockdown measures?
Well, I wish I had an answer to that. I simply don't know. I completely agree that there should be a civilized discussion about these issues.
Can I have a sense, Professor, can I ask you, for daring to speak out and offer a different view, what sort of reception have you had? Have you experienced trolling? Have you received abuse online? How much has it affected you on a personal note?
Well, of course, it's affected me very negatively. It's very distressing to, obviously the Twitter space, which I think academics have rather unwisely been using as a platform for these ideas, is filled with personal accusations, and but so is some of the representation in the press has been really problematic. The Guardian has published several articles attacking us personally and deriding us for taking these views, but they're not giving us the right of reply. So it does feel rather one-sided, and I just don't understand how personal attacks could be seen as a mode of response. I think we welcome, obviously, criticisms both of the science and of the policy, and the opportunity to offer a rebuttal on these. But why it has to descend into personal abuse and questioning our motives, essentially telling us that we're lying with a motive. It doesn't get any worse than that, especially coming from people you consider to be your friends and colleagues.
Final point, Professor. Ultimately, we're entering the cold winter months when the NHS is, at the best of times, rather oversubscribed and in demand at full stretch. It was last year and the winter before. So whilst some may be sympathetic to the approach, the sort of, ideas around the Great Barrington Declaration, Have we missed the boat on that now? Have we missed the boat on the Sweden strategy, given the fact that we're entering these cold winter months? Is it going to have to wait till spring now before we liberate society?
Well, that's a good question. I wish we had. I think we've missed the boat on shoring up the hospitals or creating the systems that would take up the slack, or to move away, as we must do, from this notion of efficiency, taking precedence over resilience, which is what's happened in the national health system. Hopefully that's a lesson we've learned, and I wish we'd acted on it over the summer instead of sort of smugly waiting for the winter and hoping against hope that it would have just gone away because we were all wearing masks. So I do think we've missed the boat on creating more resilience in the system, and I really wish we hadn't. But now I think if we just focus on protecting the vulnerable if we make that our goal, hopefully we'll get through this season no matter what.
All views welcome on Talk Radio, including those of Professor Sunetra Gupta, one of the most respected virologists in the world, Professor of Theoretical Epidemiology at the University of Oxford, one of the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration. We've heard both sides. We've spoken to Dr. Elisabetta Gropelli, virologist and lecturer on global health, who takes a different view. What's yours? Have we missed the boat in terms of taking the Swedish approach, given the fact that it's going to get colder and there are going to be more respiratory viruses anyway? Do we need to hold fire now till spring and accept the government's approach? 03444991000. My thanks to Professor Gupta. Next up, we'll talk about the BBC.